My husband deployed to South Korea for 17 months. While he was overseas, my family moved my twin sister into our house, into our bedroom. She wore my clothes, used my dishes, told the neighbors she was the real wife. When my husband came home 2 weeks early, he did not knock. What he found inside ended 2 marriages. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The key stuck in the lock. Maya jiggled at exhaustion, pulling at her shoulders after a grueling 3-day real estate conference in Chicago. But the lock had not just stuck, it had been changed. Before she could knock, the heavy oak door swung open. Standing there was a mirror image of herself, Malia. But it was not just Malia. She was wearing Maya's custom emerald green silk robe, the one Julian had bought her in Italy. In her hand was a mug that read, "Julian and Maya established 2018. "Oh, you are back early," Malia said, not stepping aside. Her tone was casual, as if she were the homeowner addressing a delivery driver. "You need to use the side entrance. Trent is resting in the living room and the HOA ladies are coming over for wine. They think I am you, by the way. It is just easier that way. Your basement is unlocked." Maya stared, her brain misfiring. "The basement, Malia. What are you doing in my house?" "Mom did not tell you," Malia sighed, taking a sip of the coffee. "Trent's firm is undergoing a restructuring. We lost our lease. Mom said since Julian is playing G.I. Joe in Korea for another 2 months, you would not mind giving up the master suite. It is the Christian thing to do, Maya." Maya pushed past her twin. The scent of cheap cigar smoke hit her instantly. There, sitting in Julian's favorite leather recliner feet, propped up on the pristine coffee table, was Trent. Her white brother-in-law smirked, ash falling onto the Persian rug. He was wearing Julian's West Point sweatshirt. "Hey there, Maya," Trent drawled, his tone dripping with the usual condescension. "House has good bones. A bit too urban in the decor, but I am having some guys come tomorrow to paint over that accent wall. Hope you do not mind. We needed the space." Before Maya could scream, the sound of a heavy boot kicking open the back patio door echoed through the house. Julian stood there, still in his combat boots. Arrived 2 weeks early. His eyes locked onto Trent wearing his clothes, then to Malia wearing his wife's lingerie. Julian did not shout. The terrifying calm of a military intelligence officer washed over his face as his hand instinctively rested on the holster at his waist. "You have exactly 10 seconds, Julian said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees to take off my shirt, get out of my chair, and get out of my house." Trent scoffed, standing up to use his height advantage. "Relax, soldier boy. We are family. We were just keeping the place warm since your wife is clearly too unstable to manage a property this big alone." Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward Trent, but the sound of screeching tires in our driveway broke the tension. Headlights flooded the living room through the sheer curtains. The heavy front door was thrown open again and my parents barged inside. Patricia and Pastor Calvin did not look confused or horrified by the scene in my living room. They did not gasp at seeing my twin sister in my custom lingerie or her husband wearing my husband's clothes. They looked absolutely furious, and their anger was directed entirely at me. My mother marched across the Persian rug with her eyes locked onto mine. Before I could even open my mouth to explain the madness happening in my own home, she raised her hand and struck me hard across the face. The sharp sting of her palm against my cheek echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged room. She hissed at me, asking how dare I threaten to call the police on my own sister. She said Trent lost his firm last month, and they needed a place to stay. She pointed her finger at my chest, saying I had an entire house sitting here empty while my husband was away, and that I always had to be so incredibly selfish. She brought up the past, claiming I was acting just like the time I refused to co-sign Malia's massive student loans. She said I always wanted to see my sister fail. I stood there tasting the faint metallic tang of blood inside my cheek. I did not cry because years of being the scapegoat in this family had burned the tears out of me a long time ago. My father stood behind her, nodding in agreement with his hands tucked into his tailored suit pockets. He was a pastor who preached about grace and honesty every Sunday, yet he looked at me with absolute disdain. He stepped forward and placed a protective hand on Trent's shoulder, as if the grown man wearing my husband's clothes was the real victim here. Julian stepped firmly between me and my mother. His physical presence forced her to take a step back. His voice was dangerously quiet, as he told her she had lost her mind if she thought she could walk into his home and lay a hand on his wife. He stated clearly that this was our property, and that they broke in and would be leaving tonight. Trent laughed from the recliner while swirling the last of his drink. He smirked and told Julian that they did not break in because Maya gave them the keys. He lied effortlessly, saying I told them they could have the master bedroom. I stared at him while my mind struggled to comprehend the sheer audacity of the lie. I stated coldly that I had been in Chicago for 3 days and never gave anyone keys. I demanded that they go upstairs, pack whatever garbage they brought into my house, and leave immediately. Right on cue, Malia began her performance. Her lower lip quivered and her eyes filled with perfectly timed tears. She had been crying on demand since we were 7 years old, always using tears to get away with breaking things and blaming me. Now at 29, she was using the exact same tactic to steal a whole house. She shrank back against the wall, pulling my emerald silk robe tighter around her body to make herself look small and defenseless. She let a single tear fall down her cheek and sobbed to our mother that I was lying again. Malia claimed I told her she could have the master suite because the basement was too cold for her delicate skin. She whimpered about how easily she gets sick and said I told her it was fine since I was always working and Julian was deployed. She cried that now I was trying to throw them out into the street just to be cruel. My mother immediately rushed to Malia, wrapping her arms around her golden child. She glared at me over Malia's shoulder, holding her tightly. She called me a bitter, jealous liar. She declared that my sister was fragile right now, and Trent was going through a massive career transition. She reminded me that we were a Christian family who provided for our own. She demanded that I let them stay here until they got back on their feet, or I would have to answer to her and my father. My father chimed in with his deep pastor voice echoing off the walls. He stated that Trent was a respectable businessman who simply made a bad investment. He lectured me about forgiveness and providing shelter. He asked me to think about what it would do to the reputation of his church if his white son-in-law and his daughter were forced to live in a motel. He told me I had plenty of room in the basement and that it was my duty to accommodate them. I looked at the people who raised me. They were standing in my house demanding I live in my own cold basement, so my twin sister could play house in my master bedroom, with a man who looked at me like I was dirt beneath his shoes. They truly believed I would just lower my head and accept it. They believed I was still the quiet, obedient girl who took the blame for everything. I locked eyes with Malia and told her I was giving them 5 minutes to get their things. I promised her that if they were not out of my house, I would drag her out by that robe myself. While the argument raged and my mother started yelling scriptures at me, Julian had silently slipped away from the living room. His military training made him hyper-observant, and he had noticed something wrong down the hallway. He did not engage in the shouting match. He simply vanished into the shadows of the corridor leading to his home office. My father was mid-sentence telling me how I was a disappointment to the family name when Julian returned. The terrifying calm from earlier had hardened into something much colder. He walked straight past Trent and my screaming mother to stand right beside me. His face was a mask of absolute stone, unreadable to my parents but screaming alarm bells to me. Julian leaned down, placing his lips close to my ear so no one else could hear him over my mother's ranting. He did not sound angry anymore, but entirely tactical. He whispered that the heavy steel safe behind his bookshelf had scratch marks from a crowbar and had been forced open. My stomach plummeted as I looked up at him. Julian shook his head slightly with his eyes fixed on Trent, who was still smirking from the chair. Julian murmured that his classified military laptop was untouched. He paused, taking a slow breath before delivering the final blow. He whispered that my social security card and the deed to our house were gone. The cold dread pooling in my stomach quickly morphed into a blinding rage. I stepped away from Julian and looked directly at Trent, who was now pouring himself a glass of Julian's expensive scotch from the bar cart. I told him he was a thief and a fraud, and that he had exactly 1 minute to hand over my documents before I called the federal authorities. Trent did not even flinch. He took a slow sip of the amber liquid and let out a patronizing chuckle. He leaned against the bar and told me to calm down and lower my voice. He said I was acting erratic and proving his point. He looked around my beautifully decorated living room and then looked back at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. He told me to listen closely. He said the Neighborhood Homeowners Association loved him and Malia. He bragged that he had already been attending the meetings and playing golf with the board members. Then he delivered a comment so casually cruel and racist that it sucked the air right out of the room. He said the neighborhood needed a guy like him on the board to keep the property values high. He looked me up and down and stated that the board preferred a successful businessman over a single black woman whose husband was off playing pretend soldier overseas. He said I did not fit the demographic of this community and that he was actually doing me a favor by maintaining the standard of the house. My father actually nodded at this. He told me I should be grateful that Trent was stepping up to manage the property while Julian was gone. He said a house this size was too much responsibility for a woman alone, and that Trent had the proper business acumen to deal with the neighborhood association. I felt sick to my stomach hearing my own father tear me down, just to elevate a man who was stealing from us. I asked my parents how they could stand there and support this invasion. I asked them if they had completely lost their minds. My mother just scoffed and told me to stop playing the victim because Malia needed a stable environment. Before Julian could step forward and forcibly remove Trent from the premises, the front doorbell chimed. Without waiting for an answer, the door pushed open, and Mrs. Higgins, the notoriously nosy Homeowners Association president, walked right into my foyer. She was holding a plate of freshly baked cookies wrapped in clear cellophane with a bright yellow ribbon. She had a wide, overly bright smile on her face that vanished the second she felt the thick tension in the room. Mrs. Higgins completely ignored me and walked straight over to Malia. She handed the cookies to my sister and called her Maya. She told her she brought her famous chocolate chip cookies to welcome her to the neighborhood board committee. I stood frozen as I watched my twin sister accept the cookies with a sweet, practiced smile, thanking Mrs. Higgins and playing the role of the gracious hostess in my own home. Malia even had the nerve to adjust the collar of my silk robe and tell Mrs. Higgins that she and Trent were so excited to host the next neighborhood block party. Then Mrs. Higgins turned her attention to me, her eyes filled with a sickening mixture of pity and superiority. She sighed heavily and gave me a condescending look. She told me I must be the unfortunate twin sister Malia. She said Maya had told the entire neighborhood all about my tragic situation. She reached out and patted my arm, treating me like a charity case. She said it was such a blessing that Maya and her successful husband Trent were allowing me to stay in their basement while I got back on my feet. My brain could barely process the words coming out of her mouth. Malia had not just moved into my house, she had stolen my entire life. She had introduced herself to the neighborhood as Maya and passed Trent off as her husband. She had taken my identity, my home, and my hard-earned reputation. Mrs. Higgins then noticed Julian standing rigidly nearby. She gave him a polite nod and asked if he was my military husband who was finally back from his deployment. She told Julian he should be deeply grateful to Maya and Trent for giving me a place to live, especially since my fragile mental state and my tragic infertility had made it so difficult for me to function in society. The word infertility hit me like a physical strike. The breath left my lungs. Malia knew how much Julian and I had struggled to start a family. She knew the pain of those negative tests and the tears I had shed in private. And she had taken my deepest vulnerability, twisted it, and broadcast it to a neighborhood of strangers, claiming it as her own fabricated backstory for me. I looked at my mother and father, expecting them to correct this insane woman, but they stood in absolute silence. My parents were entirely complicit in this massive delusion. They were letting my sister parade around as me just so her white husband could fit into a wealthy suburban neighborhood and maintain his illusion of success. Julian stepped closer to me, his entire body rigid with contained fury. He told Mrs. Higgins in a dangerously calm voice that she was speaking to the real Maya and that he was Julian, the actual owner of this house. Mrs. Higgins let out a nervous little laugh, looking back and forth between me and Malia. She clearly did not believe him. She clutched her purse and backed toward the door, stammering that she did not want to intrude on family drama before quickly letting herself out. She shot one last sympathetic look at Malia before the heavy door clicked shut. Malia immediately began crying again, burying her face in Trent's shoulder, complaining that Julian was ruining her reputation with the neighbors. My mother glared at Julian, telling him he had no right to embarrass Malia in front of important community members. She said we were acting like animals and bringing shame to the family name. But I was not listening to my mother anymore. The realization of what Julian had whispered earlier about the missing Social Security card, and the deed hit me with terrifying clarity. If Malia was pretending to be me to the neighbors, she could be pretending to be me everywhere else. The physical resemblance between us was absolute. We shared the same bone structure, the same eyes, the same voice. I pulled my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers and immediately opened my banking application. Because we were identical twins, our biometric facial features were close enough to sometimes confuse basic security software. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the device. I stared at the screen as the dashboard loaded. The numbers blurred together for a fraction of a second before coming into sharp, devastating focus. A notification popped up confirming a recent transaction. A withdrawal had just been processed and approved less than an hour ago. $50,000 was gone from my savings account. It was the inheritance advance my grandfather had left specifically for Julian and me to start our family. Malia had used her face to bypass my security and drain my entire life savings. I stared at the screen as the numbers burned into my mind. I turned to Julian and told him my life savings was gone. I explained that $50,000 had just been withdrawn from my account. Julian did not waste a single second. He grabbed my arm and guided me straight out the front door, leaving my parents and my sister standing in our foyer. We got into his truck and sped toward the local bank branch down the street. My chest was tight with panic as I tried to process how Malia could have possibly authorized such a massive transfer without my phone. I felt sick knowing she had been planning this invasion long before Julian came home. When we burst through the glass doors of the bank, the branch manager greeted me with a confused smile. She asked why I was back so soon and said she hoped there were no issues with the large transfer I had just requested. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told the manager I had not been to the bank in weeks. The manager shook her head and insisted that I was just sitting in her office an hour ago. She pulled up the security footage on her monitor, and there it was. Malia was wearing my green trench coat and carrying my favorite handbag. Because we are identical twins, her face easily bypassed the biometric security on my banking application to initiate the transfer. She had simply walked into the branch, smiled at the tellers who had known me for years, and forged my signature perfectly. She transferred every single cent of the money my grandfather left me into an external account under Trent's name. The manager began to panic, realizing she had just handed $50,000 to an imposter. Julian told her to freeze my accounts and secure the surveillance tapes immediately. We did not wait for her to finish apologizing. I ran back to the truck with a blinding rage taking over my entire body. My sister had not just taken my home and my clothes, she had stolen the money Julian and I had been saving to fund our next round of fertility treatments. She knew exactly what that money was meant for. Julian drove us back to our house and slammed the brakes when we saw Trent's car parked sideways in our driveway. Malia was standing near the trunk, loading several high-end shopping bags into the back. She had gone on a luxury shopping spree with my money the second the transfer cleared. Trent was leaning against the car hood, scrolling through his phone with a smug look on his face. I threw the truck door open before Julian even put the vehicle in park. I marched straight up the driveway and demanded that Malia hand over the money she just stole from my bank account. Malia did not even flinch. She placed a designer shoebox into the trunk and turned to face me with a soft, innocent laugh. She rolled her eyes and told me to stop being so dramatic in front of the neighbors. She brushed a piece of hair behind her ear and claimed she did not steal anything. She said our dad told her she could take it because it was technically her half of the inheritance advance anyway. I told her that money was left specifically to me by our grandfather, and she had absolutely no right to forge my signature. Malia let out a cruel sigh and looked at me with deep, fake pity. She crossed her arms and said I was being entirely unreasonable. She told me Trent needed the capital to get his new business off the ground so they could secure their future. Then she tilted her head and delivered a blow so vicious it knocked the wind right out of me. She asked me what I even needed $50,000 for anyway. She looked at Julian and then back at me, stating that since I was completely barren and could not give my husband a child, I was just hoarding money for no reason. She said Trent and she were planning to build a real family, and the money was better spent on people who could actually carry on the family legacy. A hot white flash of fury exploded behind my eyes. The years of gaslighting, the theft of my home, the racist disrespect from her husband, and now her weaponizing my deepest pain to justify robbing me pushed me completely over the edge. I lunged at her. I reached out to grab that designer shirt right off her back and wipe that smug smile off her face. Malia shrieked and stumbled backward against the car, dropping her expensive bags onto the concrete. Before my hands could reach her, Julian stepped between us. His strong arms wrapped securely around my waist, pulling me backward and completely off my feet. I struggled against him, screaming at Malia that she was a thief and a monster. Trent stepped forward, raising his fists and yelling at Julian to control his crazy wife. Julian did not look at Trent. He held me tightly against his chest and walked me backward down the driveway away from them. I cried out to Julian, asking him why he was stopping me. I told him they took everything we had saved. Julian did not shout. He lowered his face to my ear and spoke in a voice so calm and calculated it sent a shiver down my spine. He told me to stop fighting and to let her keep the money for now. I shook my head in disbelief, asking him how he could possibly say that. Julian kept his eyes locked on Trent and Malia as he gently set me down on my feet. He whispered that Trent's bank account was registered in a different state. He explained that Malia did not just steal money from a sister, she forged documents and committed wire fraud across state lines to steal from a military family. Julian pulled out his phone and whispered that the local police could not handle this level of federal crime. He told me to smile because he was calling the Criminal Investigation Division. Julian ended the call and walked over to his truck to pull out his encrypted military tablet. He did not say a word to Trent or Malia, who were now standing nervously by their car. He logged into his secure military personnel portal right there in the driveway. His jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the screen. He turned the tablet toward me, and the betrayal reached an entirely new and sickening level. Malia had not just stolen my money and my identity with the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, she had actually contacted the military benefits office posing as me. She had submitted fraudulent medical documents claiming that I had been recently diagnosed with a severe terminal illness. Based on that horrific lie, she had initiated the paperwork to alter Julian's military life insurance policy. She had attempted to name Trent as the secondary beneficiary in the event of Julian's death overseas. My sister was literally banking on my husband dying in combat while pretending I was dying of a terminal disease, all so her husband could collect a massive government payout. I felt the concrete driveway spin beneath my feet. This was no longer just petty theft or childhood jealousy. This was incredibly dark and deeply calculated. They were planning to profit off our deaths. My father walked out of the front door and marched down the driveway toward us. Pastor Calvin had watched the entire confrontation from the living room window, and he was visibly sweating. He stepped between Julian and Trent, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He looked at Julian and begged him to drop the investigation and stop this nonsense immediately. He used his soft preaching voice, telling Julian that Trent simply made a bad investment and panicked. He said we are all Christians and that the core of our faith is forgiveness and grace. My father actually put his hand on Julian's chest and pleaded with him not to ruin his white son-in-law's record over what he called a simple financial misunderstanding. He looked at me with pleading eyes and said that if Trent went to federal prison, it would absolutely destroy the reputation of his church. He said his congregation would never respect him again if his own family was involved in a federal fraud scandal. He told Julian to just let Trent pay the money back over time and to keep the federal authorities out of family business. He even suggested that as a military man, Julian should understand the importance of protecting the family unit. Julian swatted my father's hand away and told him that forging federal military documents was not a family business matter, but a direct threat to national security. He told my father that his church's reputation meant absolutely nothing compared to the safety of his wife. While my father continued to beg and justify Trent's criminal behavior, I pulled out my own phone. As a licensed commercial real estate appraiser, I had access to deep financial databases and skip tracing software that the general public could not reach. I needed to know exactly what kind of bad investment Trent had made that would drive my sister to commit federal treason and drain my life savings. I typed Trent's full legal name into my secure portal. I bypassed the basic credit checks and dug straight into the secured liens and shadow judgments attached to his failing firm. The results loaded on my screen and the blood completely drained from my face. Trent had not just lost his real estate firm to a bad market. He had been illegally leveraging commercial properties and gambling with offshore funds. He was not just broke or struggling. The database showed he currently owed $2 million to a highly dangerous shadow syndicate. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as the horrific truth settled heavily into my bones. Trent was not just a lazy squatter stealing our space. He was a desperate man backed into a lethal corner by violent people. I knew that confronting them right then in the driveway would only result in more of my mother's delusional excuses and Pastor Calvin's hollow sermons about grace. Julian and I needed a public arena where Trent and Malia could not hide behind their carefully constructed Christian facade. We needed an audience that mattered to them. The perfect opportunity arrived exactly 2 days later. It was Sunday, and in my family attendance at my parents' weekly post-church dinner was considered strictly mandatory. Julian and I walked into my parents' formal dining room holding our heads high. The long mahogany table was set with my mother's best china and crystal glasses. Malia and Trent were already seated next to my father at the head of the table holding court like absolute royalty among the gathered extended family and senior church elders. I took my seat quietly, waiting for the inevitable performance to begin. I did not have to wait long. My mother tapped her crystal water glass with a silver spoon to command the attention of the room. She beamed with overwhelming pride and told the entire table that she wanted to take a moment to publicly thank Malia and Trent. She practically glowed as she praised them for so graciously stepping up to take care of my massive house and manage my property while Julian was deployed. She looked at the church elders and called my sister and her husband the true selfless pillars of our family. I felt Julian's hand gently press against my knee under the table, a silent signal of support. I stood up slowly from my chair, picking up my own glass. I looked at my mother and told her she was absolutely right to bring up Trent's incredible property management skills. Then I turned my gaze directly to Trent. I raised my voice, ensuring that every single person at the long table could hear me clearly. I announced that Trent was doing such a fantastic job managing my home that I decided to look into exactly how he managed his own commercial real estate firm. The dining room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I revealed to the room that Trent did not lose his firm to a bad economy or a simple market downturn. I stated clearly and factually that he had been illegally leveraging commercial properties and gambling with offshore funds. I told the church elders, who were now staring with wide eyes, that Trent currently owed $2 million to a highly dangerous underground shadow syndicate. I explained that Trent was facing violent retaliation and was desperately trying to steal my house and Julian's military life insurance benefits just to save his own skin. A collective gasp echoed through the dining room. Trent's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray as his eyes darted toward the church elders. But my mother did not look at Trent. She did not question the massive criminal debt I had just exposed. Instead, she turned her absolute fury entirely on me. She grabbed her heavy crystal glass and hurled the ice-cold water directly into my face. The water splashed hard against my skin, dripping down my chin and soaking into my silk collar as the entire table froze in absolute shock. My mother slammed her hands on the table and screamed that I was a bitter, vindictive liar. She yelled that I was just jealous, and that I had been insanely jealous ever since Trent chose Malia over me. She shrieked that I could not handle the fact that Trent had hit on me first 5 years ago, and when I utterly rejected him, he immediately found happiness with my twin sister. She claimed I was trying to destroy his life now because I finally realized what a huge mistake I made by turning down such a successful, wealthy man. I wiped the freezing water from my eyes, completely stunned by my mother's delusional rewriting of history. I opened my mouth to defend myself against this insane alternate reality, but Trent suddenly leaned forward in his chair. The color had returned to his face, replacing his initial panic with a cold, calculated smirk. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slid the heavy parchment paper slowly across the mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my dinner plate. He tapped the document with his index finger, staring at me with pure malice. He calmly announced to the silent room that it did not matter what I claimed he owed or what wild lies I told the family. He told me to read the document carefully because the house was no longer mine to control. I looked down at the official county clerk stamp pressed into the top corner. It was a recorded quitclaim deed. Malia had used my stolen identity and her identical face to legally sign away my property. She had legally transferred the title and put Trent's name directly on the deed to my house. Trent leaned back in his heavy dining chair and folded his arms across his chest. He looked at Julian and then at me with a sickening grin of absolute victory. He boasted loudly to the entire room that he had already leveraged my house for a $500,000 business loan. He told the church elders that the bank had already approved the commercial funds and wired the cash directly into his business account yesterday. He picked up his crystal wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down. He announced with perfect arrogance that it was his house now. He stared right into my eyes and said that Julian and I needed to pack our bags because our official eviction notice would be arriving on Monday morning. My mother smiled triumphantly, and Pastor Calvin let out a heavy sigh of relief, thinking the conflict was finally settled. Malia sat next to her husband, looking like a queen who had just conquered a new kingdom. They all waited for me to break down. They expected me to cry and beg for my childhood home, or scream in absolute defeat. But I did not cry. I did not shout or throw a tantrum the way my mother had just moments before. Instead, I looked down at the forged quitclaim deed sitting next to my dinner plate, and a slow, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The laughter bubbled up from my chest and grew until it echoed loudly off the formal dining room walls. The sound completely unsettled everyone at the table. Trent's smug smile faltered immediately. He leaned forward and demanded to know what was so funny about losing my home and my life savings. I stopped laughing and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I reminded Trent that I am a top-tier commercial real estate appraiser. I told him I spend my entire life analyzing contracts, and I know state property law better than any lawyer he could ever afford to hire. I explained that 6 months ago, when Julian first received his deployment orders, I took severe legal precautions to protect our assets from exactly this kind of family invasion. I revealed to the dead silent dining room that I had placed a strict county title freeze on the property. I watched Trent's jaw drop as I explained that I had also transferred the actual ownership of the house into a secondary, hidden corporate LLC layer. I made it legally impossible for any single individual to transfer the deed without multiple corporate authorized signatures and highly secure biometric verifications. The piece of paper Trent had slid across the table was completely worthless. It was nothing more than a fake document printed to look official. Trent's face went completely blank as he stared at the forged deed, realizing his master plan was falling apart in front of his church leaders. But my mind was already moving 3 steps ahead of his realization. The truth hit me with a beautiful wave of clarity. If Trent had actually secured a $500,000 loan from a bank using a frozen title and a forged deed, he had not just stolen from a family member. He had lied to a major financial institution. He had committed textbook federal mortgage fraud across state lines. The penalties for defrauding a national bank carried decades in federal prison and absolute financial ruin. I looked at his shaking hands and realized the massive, inescapable trap he had just walked into, but I did not tell him about the federal crimes. I did not mention the FBI or the banking authorities that would soon be knocking on his door. I simply smiled at him and let him sit there thinking he had somehow won. Trent stared back at me as his fake confidence faltered for just a fraction of a second. My mother could not stand the heavy silence settling over the room. She saw my calm smile and immediately assumed I was plotting another way to ruin her perfect family dinner. Before she could launch into another screaming fit, Malia suddenly gripped the edge of the mahogany table and let out a dramatic gasp. She swayed heavily in her wooden chair and collapsed against Trent's shoulder. Trent caught her looking genuinely startled for a moment before catching on to her performance. My mother shrieked and rushed to Malia's side, aggressively fanning her face with a linen napkin. Pastor Calvin hovered nearby, asking if he needed to call for medical help. Malia slowly fluttered her eyes open and placed a gentle hand over her flat stomach. She looked up at my mother with a tearful smile and whispered that she was not sick, but that she was pregnant with Trent's baby. The dining room erupted into chaotic joy. My mother threw her arms around Trent and wept loudly, thanking God for blessing the family with a new legacy. Pastor Calvin loudly praised the Lord for this miracle, completely ignoring the fact that the miracle father was drowning in illegal syndicate debt. My father patted Trent on the back, congratulating him on becoming a real family man. Then my mother turned her tear-stained face toward me, and her joy instantly morphed into absolute disgust. She pointed a shaking finger at the hallway and demanded that Julian and I pack our bags immediately. She stated that the stress of my bitter jealousy was a direct threat to her unborn grandchild. She told me that since I was barren and could not give them a child, I had absolutely no right to take up space in a home that now belonged to a growing family. She commanded me to leave my own house entirely so the new mother could have peace and prepare for her baby without my toxic presence. I opened my mouth to tell my mother that the house was legally locked in a trust, and that they were all participating in a massive criminal delusion. I wanted to scream that Malia was weaponizing my painful infertility yet again just to secure her stolen prize. But before I could speak, Julian stepped forward and firmly grabbed my hand. He looked my mother dead in the eyes, and his voice was completely devoid of emotion. He nodded slowly and told my mother that she was right. He said that we would go. My mother froze mid-breath. Malia peeked out from behind Trent's shoulder, her delicate, fragile posture completely dropping as she stared at us in total shock. They had fully expected a massive screaming match. They had braced themselves for a legal battle right there in the dining room, and my husband's easy surrender left them completely stunned. Trent narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out what angle Julian was playing, but Julian did not give them a single second to process their easy victory. He simply pulled me toward the hallway leading to the guest bedroom where we had stored our overnight bags. I pulled back against Julian's grip the second we were out of their sight line. I whispered frantically, asking him why on earth we were surrendering my house to a syndicate gambler and a pregnant fraud. Julian did not answer me immediately. He quietly zipped up our duffel bags and threw them over his broad shoulders. As we walked back through the formal dining room to head toward the front door, the rest of the family was busy crowding around Malia, taking celebratory photos. Julian paused near the head of the long mahogany table, pretending to tie his heavy boot. I watched in absolute awe as his hand moved with practiced military precision. He slipped a microscopic military-grade recording bug directly under the thick wooden lip of the dining table, pressing it firmly into the grain where it was completely invisible. He stood up, brushing off his hands, and guided me out the front door, leaving them all to celebrate their hollow victory inside a fully monitored trap. The drive away from my childhood home was suffocatingly quiet. I sat in the passenger seat of Julian's truck, watching the familiar suburban streets blur past my window. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, knowing my mother had so easily tossed me aside for a counterfeit pregnancy and a fraudulent son-in-law. Julian did not take us to a cheap motel. He navigated straight to the most exclusive luxury hotel in the downtown financial district. He booked their top-floor penthouse suite using his secured military account. When we finally stepped into the quiet elegance of the massive suite, the heavy oak door closed behind us, shutting out the madness of my family. I dropped my bags on the marble floor and finally looked at my husband. I asked him how we could just walk away and let them take everything. Julian did not say a single word to comfort me. Instead, he walked over to the glass coffee table, opened his heavy tactical backpack, and pulled out his military encrypted laptop. He synced the device to the microscopic audio bug he had planted under my parents' mahogany dining table. He typed in a secure passcode, and suddenly the pristine silence of our hotel room was replaced by the chaotic, deafening sounds of my house. Trent had wasted absolutely no time. The moment our truck had pulled out of the driveway, he had started making phone calls. Through the crystal-clear audio feed, we could hear loud thumping bass echoing through my living room. Trent had invited dozens of his sleazy tech firm friends over for a massive impromptu victory party. We sat on the edge of the hotel bed listening in absolute disgust as the sound of clinking beer bottles and raucous laughter filled the feed. I could hear the sickening sound of my expensive crystal glassware shattering against the hardwood floors, followed by careless cheers. They were completely trashing my home. Trent's voice boomed over the music, slurring heavily with expensive scotch that he had undoubtedly raided from my private liquor cabinet. He was bragging loudly to his friends about how easily he had manipulated my entire family. I gripped the hotel bedsheets as Trent openly mocked Julian's military service. He laughed hysterically, calling my husband a brainless combat grunt who was too stupid to realize his own house had been stolen right out from under him. He joked about how he could not wait for Julian to be deployed again, so he could fully liquidate the rest of our assets without any interference. The sheer disrespect made my blood boil. But Julian remained perfectly still. He just sat there staring at the audio wavelengths bouncing across his screen with cold, predatory patience. Hours passed as the loud party slowly died down. The heavy bass finally stopped, and the voices of Trent's drunken friends faded out the front door. We could hear the quiet shuffling of Malia heading upstairs to the master bedroom, complaining about being tired from faking her pregnancy symptoms all afternoon. Soon it was just Trent alone in the dining room. Then the audio feed picked up the distinct buzzing vibration of a cell phone ringing. Trent answered it immediately, and his arrogant swagger completely vanished. His voice dropped to a terrified, panicked whisper. Julian amplified the volume and filtered out the background noise. We could clearly hear the menacing voice on the other end of the line. It was one of the Shadow Syndicate collectors demanding their $2 million repayment by the end of the week. Trent was literally begging for his life. He promised the dangerous creditor that he had a guaranteed payout ready for tomorrow. My heart stopped as Trent began to list out my personal assets to a ruthless criminal. He told the collector that he had unrestricted access to my husband's military armory room. He promised to sell thousands of dollars worth of Julian's high-end tactical gear and night vision equipment on the black market. Then he delivered the ultimate blow. He told the creditor that he had found the hidden wall safe in my master suite. He bragged that it was filled with my late grandmother's irreplaceable vintage diamond jewelry. Trent promised the violent syndicate member that he would pawn every single heirloom first thing tomorrow morning to cover the first installment of his massive debt. Julian slowly closed his laptop screen. The soft click echoed loudly in the quiet hotel suite. The raw devastation of losing my grandmother's jewelry evaporated into a freezing, white-hot rage. I looked at Julian, and he gave me a single silent nod of approval. He knew exactly what had to be done. I picked up my phone and opened my encrypted client directory. As a top-tier commercial real estate appraiser, I handled massive foreclosures and high-profile evictions. I had direct lines to the most efficient and discreet estate liquidators in the state. I dialed the private number of my most trusted high-end moving contractor. When he answered, I did not hesitate. I told him I needed his best specialized crew at my address at exactly 3 in the morning. I told him we were not just packing boxes, but that we were stripping a 5,000 square foot house completely bare straight down to the studs. The hotel room was quiet, but the audio feed from the hidden bug was loud and clear. I stayed on the encrypted line with the estate liquidator, holding my breath as I listened to the latest development. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when my mother's voice suddenly echoed through the digital speakers. She had called Trent's phone, waking him up from his drunken stupor. Her voice was painfully cheerful and dripping with ridiculous affection. She asked how the beautiful pregnant mother was feeling. We heard Malia groaning in the background, playing up a fake routine of severe morning sickness. She whimpered and complained that the stress of the previous night had taken a terrible toll on her fragile condition. My mother immediately gasped in horror and promised to make everything right. She triumphantly announced that she had just booked them an exclusive weekend retreat at a 5-star luxury mountain spa. She insisted that they needed to leave the house immediately to relax and protect the unborn baby. She told them a private black car would arrive at exactly noon to whisk them away for 3 days of absolute pampering, all paid for by her premium credit card. Trent pretended to be overwhelmed with gratitude. He thanked my mother profusely, calling her the true matriarch of the family. But the exact second the call disconnected, the audio feed captured Trent and Malia bursting into hysterical laughter. They mocked my mother relentlessly. Trent bragged about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate the old woman into funding their lavish lifestyle. Malia laughed and said she could not wait to order thousands of dollars worth of room service on my mother's tab. They spent the next few hours packing their bags, singing and dancing around my home, acting like untouchable royalty. Julian and I sat in our hotel suite listening to every single arrogant word. The 4-hour raid we originally planned for 3 in the morning was suddenly obsolete. My mother had unknowingly handed us the greatest gift possible. We now had an entire empty weekend to execute my plan, with terrifying, absolute precision. I unmuted my phone and told the moving contractor to change the schedule. I told him we did not need the night shift anymore. I wanted his absolute best daytime crew, and I wanted them ready to move mountains. At exactly noon, Julian and I sat in his heavy truck parked a few blocks away from our house. We tracked the digital marker from the GPS device Julian had secretly slipped onto Trent's bumper weeks ago. We watched the black luxury car pull out of our driveway and head straight toward the mountain highway. We waited an extra hour just to be absolutely certain they were miles out of city limits and not turning back for forgotten luggage. Then Julian put the truck in drive, and we headed home. The sight of the house sitting there quiet and stolen made my chest physically ache. We walked up the concrete front steps and Julian bypassed the physical locks. He punched the master override code into the digital security keypad. Trent was so blindly arrogant and so painfully stupid that he had not even bothered to reset the basic security parameters. The heavy wooden door clicked open and we stepped inside. The stench of stale beer, spilled liquor, and cheap cigars hit us immediately. The remnants of Trent's disgusting victory party were scattered across every single surface. Empty glass bottles were thrown carelessly onto my expensive silk rugs. Muddy footprints tracked across the pristine imported hardwood floors. Stale pizza boxes and crushed cans littered the beautiful kitchen island. The sheer disrespect of it all should have made me scream, but I did not feel angry. I only felt a cold, mechanical determination. I walked straight upstairs to the master suite, ignoring the sticky trash in the hallway. I went directly to the custom walk-in closet and pressed my hand against the hidden wall panel. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint, and the concealed steel safe hissed open. My grandmother's vintage diamond necklaces and heavy sapphire rings sat exactly where I had left them, perfectly untouched by Trent's greedy hands. I placed the priceless velvet boxes carefully into my leather tote bag, locking my family legacy away forever. Downstairs, Julian headed straight for his reinforced armory room in the basement. He packed his expensive tactical gear, military-grade night vision goggles, and classified equipment into heavy, secure transport cases. We secured our most precious items just as a massive fleet of unmarked commercial moving trucks pulled into the long driveway. A crew of 40 highly trained professional liquidators marched up to the front porch in perfect unison. I met the foreman at the door and handed him the verified trust documents and the legal property deed, proving I was the sole legal owner of the estate. I looked him dead in the eyes and gave him the final command. I told him I did not want a single usable item left in the entire structure. I told him to strip it down to the absolute bare concrete and wood. The crew moved into the house like an army of aggressive, focused ants. It was a beautiful symphony of absolute destruction and calculated efficiency. They did not just pack up the velvet couches and the flat-screen televisions. They took absolutely everything. The massive custom mahogany dining table where Trent had sat and declared his fake victory was unbolted and carried out in pieces. The heavy leather chairs, the imported crystal chandeliers, the expensive wool rugs, all vanished into the back of the idling trucks. I walked through the echoing rooms, directing the crew to go even further. I ordered them to unscrew the custom cabinet doors in the expansive kitchen, leaving the wooden shelves completely bare and exposed. They brought in heavy industrial tools and unbolted the stainless steel smart refrigerator, the massive double oven, the built-in dishwasher, and the commercial-grade washer and dryer. They rolled up the thick, plush carpets and unhinged every single interior door in the house. The bathroom doors, the closet doors, the bedroom doors were all carried away. They took down the expensive silk window blinds and the heavy curtains, leaving the giant glass panes completely naked to the outside world. They unscrewed the expensive cabinet hardware, the towel racks, and even the toilet paper dispensers. The sound of power drills buzzing and heavy work boots stomping echoed through the massive house for 4 solid hours. Julian stood by my side with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He watched in silence as the luxury estate transformed into a cold, echoing hollow shell of drywall and concrete. The crew even removed the expensive brass light switch covers, the decorative shower heads, and the imported bathroom mirrors. Every time a crew member carried a piece of the house out the front door, I felt a heavy, crushing weight lifting off my shoulders. I was taking back my power piece by piece until there was nothing left for Trent to steal. While the moving crew was finishing up the master bathroom, I walked into the guest room that Trent and Malia had temporarily claimed as their own. The room smelled like cheap floral perfume and pure entitlement. Malia had left a messy pile of crumpled paperwork and trash on the bare mattress before the movers came to dismantle the heavy wooden bed frame. I sifted through the discarded papers just to make sure there was no sensitive mail left behind. As I pushed aside a glossy fashion magazine, a bright pink piece of paper caught my eye. I pulled it out from under the pile and stared at the bold black ink. It was a printed invoice from a cheap online novelty website. The order details clearly listed one customized fake ultrasound package with expedited overnight shipping. The total cost was $19.99. I held the flimsy piece of paper in my trembling hands, and a dark, genuine smile spread across my face. Malia had not even bothered to cover her tracks. She was so overly confident in her ability to manipulate my desperate mother that she simply left the undeniable evidence of her massive fraud sitting in plain sight. The foreman approached me holding his clipboard and announced that the trucks were fully loaded and ready to depart. I walked out of the guest bedroom and stood at the top of the sweeping grand staircase, looking down at the ground floor. The house was completely unrecognizable. Voices echoed strangely off the bare walls because there was absolutely no furniture left to absorb the sound. The naked windows stared out into the front yard like empty blank eyes. Not a single chair, not a television, not a light bulb remained. It looked like an abandoned commercial warehouse, waiting to be demolished. Julian met me at the bottom of the stairs, holding his heavy transport bags. He looked around the desolate space, and a rare, grim smile touched his lips. He nodded slowly and told me it was time to go. We walked toward the front entrance, but I stopped in the exact center of the massive, empty living room. The polished hardwood floor stretched out in every direction, completely bare and freezing cold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the fake ultrasound picture I had found attached to the pink novelty receipt. It was such a small, insignificant piece of glossy paper, but it held the power to destroy absolutely everything Trent and Malia had built. I crouched down and placed the fake ultrasound picture face up right in the middle of the empty room. It was the only item left in the entire 5,000 square foot house. It sat there perfectly illuminated by the afternoon sun streaming through the bare, unshaded windows. It was a silent, terrifying message waiting for them in the darkness. Julian opened the front door, and we walked out into the cool air, locking the heavy deadbolt behind us and leaving them to their inescapable fate. The weekend passed in a state of beautiful, absolute silence. Julian and I remained in our luxury downtown penthouse suite, ordering expensive room service and watching the live security feeds from the hidden cameras we had left active around the exterior of the house. We watched the empty driveway for 2 entire days, feeling the heavy weight of my family's betrayal slowly lifting from our shoulders. By late Sunday afternoon, the sleek black car my mother had rented pulled back into our driveway. Trent and Malia stepped out looking thoroughly relaxed and rejuvenated. Malia was wearing a plush spa robe and carrying expensive gift bags filled with luxury lotions my mother had paid for. They walked up the front concrete steps, laughing and whispering to each other, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare waiting for them on the other side of the heavy wooden door. Trent pushed the front door open, and the arrogant laughter died in his throat instantly. We watched the live feed from the porch camera as his entire body went rigid. His jaw dropped open, and he dropped his expensive leather weekend bag onto the porch. He stumbled blindly into the empty living room. Malia let out a high-pitched shriek as she followed him inside. She looked around wildly at the bare walls, the stripped kitchen, and the naked windows. The echo of her scream bounced off the drywall because there was absolutely no furniture left to absorb the sound. Then her eyes landed on the single item sitting right in the center of the hardwood floor. The fake ultrasound picture and the pink novelty receipt were waiting for her in a pool of afternoon sunlight. Trent did not waste a single second trying to figure out what happened. His mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. He assumed the Shadow Syndicate had broken in and stripped the house bare to settle his massive illegal debt. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency services. He screamed to the dispatcher that his home had been completely ransacked by a dangerous cartel and that everything of value was gone. He begged for the police to come immediately, claiming his life was in imminent danger. Julian and I were already parked in his heavy truck just down the street, waiting for the inevitable panic. The moment we saw the local police cruisers flying past us, with their sirens blaring, we pulled out and followed them right into the driveway. We walked up the front steps just as 2 uniformed officers were trying to calm down a hyperventilating Trent. Malia was sitting on the bare floor, crying real terrified tears as she stared at her fake ultrasound receipt. She realized her ultimate leverage over my mother was completely destroyed, and her golden ticket was gone. When Trent saw Julian and me walking through the front door, his face twisted into absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger at us and screamed at the officers, demanding they arrest us immediately. He yelled that we were the ones who had stolen his furniture and vandalized his property. He frantically explained that he was the new legal owner of the house and that we were dangerous trespassers who had broken in to ruin his life. The officers turned to us with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of certified legal documents. I handed the lead officer the corporate trust deed, the biometric security logs, and the county title freeze confirmation. I calmly explained that I am the sole legal owner of the estate and every single item inside of it. I told the officers that my husband and I had simply decided to hire a professional moving crew to clear out our own belongings in preparation for a massive home renovation. The lead officer reviewed the documents carefully, checking the official county seals and my state identification. He handed the thick stack of papers back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to Trent, and his voice was completely flat. He told Trent that this was a civil matter and that absolutely no crime had been committed. He explained that a property owner is perfectly within their rights to move their own furniture out of their own house at any time they see fit. Trent looked like he was going to vomit. He stepped forward and stammered about the forged quitclaim deed claiming my mother had given him the house as a gift for his new baby. The officer narrowed his eyes and issued a stern warning. He told Trent that wasting police time with false robbery reports was a punishable offense. He advised Trent to pack up his remaining bags and vacate the premises if he could not provide a legitimate lease agreement or proof of residency. The officers turned around and walked out the front door, leaving Trent standing in the middle of the freezing, empty living room. The reality of his inescapable situation crashed down on him all at once. The ruthless syndicate was expecting their massive $2 million repayment tomorrow morning. Trent had promised them thousands of dollars in tactical military gear and priceless vintage diamond jewelry that no longer existed. The house was an empty shell, and he had absolutely nothing left to sell or pawn. He started pacing frantically, running his hands through his hair and muttering under his breath about how he was a dead man. Malia sat on the floor sobbing loudly, asking him how they were going to survive without my mother's money or the house. She looked up at me and begged for mercy, claiming she was just trying to secure a safe future for her growing family. I looked down at her and reminded her that she was not pregnant. I pointed to the pink novelty receipt sitting next to the ultrasound picture and told her that her entire future was built on a $19 lie. Trent stopped his frantic pacing and stared at Julian with wide, panicked eyes. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to salvage some miserable shred of his arrogant pride. He told Julian that this was not over and that my mother would hire the best lawyers in the city to destroy us and take the house back by force. Julian did not flinch. He walked slowly toward Trent, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the bare wood floor. He stopped just inches away from Trent's face, forcing the coward to look him in the eye. Julian reached inside his tactical jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder. He slapped the folder hard against Trent's chest, making him stumble backward in surprise. Julian spoke in a voice so cold and quiet it sent shivers down my spine. He told Trent that he had some close friends in the military criminal investigation division. He explained that a few weeks ago, someone had attempted to access the highly secure military database to change the primary beneficiary on his $500,000 combat life insurance policy. Trent's face went completely white. All the blood drained from his cheeks and his hands began to shake violently. He stared at the manila folder as if it were a live explosive device. Julian tilted his head and smiled a terrifying predator smile. He informed Trent that military cyber units do not take federal fraud lightly. He revealed that CID had successfully tracked the unauthorized access right back to the original source. Julian stepped back and casually adjusted his jacket. He looked at Trent and stated that the federal investigators had traced the illegal IP address directly back to Trent's personal laptop. Trent stood completely paralyzed in the center of the bare wooden floor, staring down at the sealed manila folder in his shaking hands. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogant swagger had evaporated the moment he realized he was not just dealing with a family dispute, but with federal military investigators. Julian did not wait around to hear whatever pathetic excuse Trent was trying to formulate. My husband simply turned his back on the trembling coward, placed his hand gently on my lower back, and guided me out the front door. We walked down the concrete steps and climbed into his heavy truck, leaving Trent and Malia alone in the freezing empty shell of a house with their shattered lies and impending federal charges. The drive back to our downtown penthouse was incredibly peaceful. For the first time in months, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. We spent the rest of the weekend in absolute quiet, simply enjoying each other's company and the beautiful realization that the worst was finally behind us. Julian spent a few hours on secure phone calls with his military commanders and legal representatives, ensuring that the cyber intrusion case was fully documented and moving forward through the proper federal channels. I spent my time sipping hot tea and watching the city skyline, finally feeling like I had my life back. But the absolute silence of my family was broken early Monday morning. My phone vibrated on the marble nightstand, illuminating the dark room. It was a text message from my father, Pastor Calvin, demanding that Julian and I meet him at his church office at exactly noon. He stated that the family crisis had gone far enough, and that it was time for us to sit down like sensible adults and negotiate a peaceful Christian resolution. He added that my mother was inconsolable, and that as a man of God he could not allow his family to be torn apart by worldly grudges. I showed the message to Julian, and we both knew exactly what this meant. My father was not looking for peace. He was looking for a way to assert his ultimate authority and force me back into submission. We arrived at the massive megachurch just before noon. The building was an ostentatious display of extreme wealth with towering stained glass windows, manicured garden walkways, and a sprawling campus that took up an entire city block. My father had built his ministry on the backs of thousands of hardworking, devoted parishioners who gave their hard-earned money every single Sunday, believing they were funding community outreach and divine charity. We walked through the heavy glass doors and made our way down the plush-carpeted hallway toward the executive pastoral suite. When I pushed open the heavy oak door, I found my father sitting behind his massive custom mahogany desk, looking like a king passing judgment. My mother, Patricia, was sitting on a tufted leather sofa in the corner, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue and playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch perfectly. She refused to even look at me when I walked in. Pastor Calvin steepled his fingers together and used his booming pulpit voice to address us. He did not ask how I was doing or apologize for demanding that I leave my own home. He immediately launched into a heavy-handed sermon about the virtues of forgiveness, family unity, and Christian charity. He paced behind his desk and declared that Malia faking her pregnancy was simply a desperate cry for help from a young woman who was overwhelmed by the pressures of the world. He completely dismissed the fact that she had actively tried to steal my property. Then he turned his attention to Trent. He waved his hand dismissively and claimed that Trent was just under extreme financial stress and made a foolish mistake regarding Julian's life insurance. He actually had the audacity to suggest that Julian was being overly vindictive by involving military investigators over what he called a simple misunderstanding. I sat in the leather guest chair and listened to my father justify massive federal fraud and cruel manipulation just to protect his precious golden child. He told me that family protects family no matter what, and that it was my duty as the older sister to absorb this burden so Malia could have a fresh start. He stated that taking the house away from Trent and Malia would ruin their lives and cast a dark shadow over the entire family legacy. Then Pastor Calvin opened the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk. He reached inside and pulled out a thick leather bank bag, dropping it heavily onto the polished wood surface. He unzipped the bag and began pulling out thick banded stacks of $100 bills, lining them up in neat rows across his desk. Next to the towering stacks of cash, he placed a certified cashier's check. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and stated that there was exactly $300,000 sitting right there. He told me it was pure, clean cash ready for me to take. He leaned forward and laid out his final demand. He told me that I would take the $300,000 and walk away. He demanded that I sign the deed of the house entirely over to Trent and Malia by the end of the day. He also demanded that Julian call his military contacts and drop all federal cyber intrusion charges against Trent immediately. He said this money was more than enough for Julian and me to start over somewhere else, and that this generous buyout was the only way to save the family from absolute destruction. I stared down at the stacks of money on the desk, and a sickening realization washed over me. I am a top-tier commercial real estate appraiser, and I spend my life analyzing financial documents and banking records. I immediately recognized the specific purple bands wrapped around the stacks of cash. They bore the distinct printed logo and routing stamps of the church's primary community outreach and building fund accounts. I looked at the cashier's check and saw the pastoral trust seal printed faintly in the corner. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. My father was not using his own personal savings to bail out his favorite daughter. He was actively and blatantly embezzling from his own devoted congregation. He was illegally draining the church's charity accounts, stealing the faithful tithes of thousands of hardworking people just to generate a massive cash buyout. He was committing textbook financial fraud and money laundering right in his own pastoral office, just to save a syndicate gambler from the consequences of his own actions. I looked up from the stolen money and stared directly into my father's arrogant eyes. I asked him if he really understood what he was doing. I told him that he was committing massive federal financial crimes to bail out a man who absolutely despised him. I reminded my father that Trent constantly mocked his sermons behind his back and laughed at his authority. I told him that Trent viewed our entire family with utter contempt and had called my beautiful home nothing more than a suburban prison. I explained that Trent was drowning in millions of dollars of illegal syndicate debt, and that this stolen church money would not even make a dent in the danger he had brought to their doorstep. My mother gasped from the sofa and finally spoke up, defending the criminal she had chosen over me. She cried out that Trent was a real man who was just trying to provide for his family, and that I was a bitter, jealous woman trying to tear them all down. She told my father not to listen to my toxic lies and urged him to force me to sign the papers. Pastor Calvin did not care about the truth. His pride and his desperate need to maintain his perfect family image completely blinded him to reality. He slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany desk, making the stacks of stolen church money tremble. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he pointed a shaking finger at me. He screamed that I was a disgrace to his ministry and a stain on his legacy. He yelled that my refusal to sacrifice for my sister proved that I had no heart and no faith. He looked at me with absolute hatred and declared that I was officially dead to him and that I was no longer his daughter. I did not cry. I did not flinch or look away from his furious glare. I stood up slowly from the leather chair, feeling incredibly tall and deeply grounded in my own truth. Julian stood right beside me, a silent and immovable wall of support. I looked down at the embezzled money and then back up at the man who had just traded his entire soul for a lie. I told him in a calm, quiet voice that I knew I was dead to him. I pushed my chair in, turned toward the heavy oak door, and paused for just a second. I looked back over my shoulder directly into his panicked, angry eyes and told him that while I might be dead to him, the IRS is going to be very alive to him. I opened the door and walked out of the church, leaving the stolen money on the desk and my toxic family behind me forever. The drive away from my father's massive megachurch was incredibly quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the absolute stillness of liberation. I sat in the passenger seat of Julian's heavy truck, watching the sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns of the church campus fade away in the rearview mirror. I had just walked away from my own father and left $300,000 of stolen embezzlement money sitting on his mahogany desk. The sheer weight of what had just happened should have crushed me, but instead I felt completely weightless. Julian reached across the wide center console and wrapped his large, warm hand around mine. His grip was steady and grounding, pulling me back from the edge of my racing thoughts. He did not say a single word because he did not need to. His silent presence was the only validation I needed to know that I had made the exact right choice. We drove back to our downtown penthouse suite, leaving the toxic manipulation of my religious family in our dust. When we walked through the doors of our luxury suite, the encrypted military laptop was already flashing with a priority alert. Julian walked over to the glass coffee table and typed in his complex access code. I dropped my leather tote bag onto the sofa and walked over to stand behind him. The alert was not from the Military Criminal Investigation Division. It was an urgent, high-priority digital notification forwarded from our primary home address. I leaned over his broad shoulder and stared at the glowing screen. It was an official emergency summons from our Neighborhood Homeowners Association. The subject line was typed in aggressive capital letters, demanding a mandatory community safety hearing for that exact same evening. My blood ran cold as I read through the attached digital letter. Trent had not wasted a single second wallowing in his miserable defeat. The moment we left him standing in the freezing, empty shell of our house, he had immediately pivoted to his next desperate strategy. He knew he could not beat us legally, and he knew the military investigators were already breathing down his neck. So he decided to weaponize the only thing he had left: his pristine corporate image and his inherent social privilege. The neighborhood we lived in was an incredibly exclusive, highly manicured gated community filled with wealthy corporate executives and retired doctors. The homeowners association was run by a woman named Margaret, who spent her entire life meticulously policing lawn heights and exterior paint colors. It was a neighborhood that prided itself on quiet conformity and absolute suburban perfection. Trent had bypassed the police entirely after they laughed in his face and went straight to Margaret. He drafted a hysterical, terrifying email to the entire HOA board, claiming that my husband was a dangerous, unhinged military veteran who had violently ransacked the property. I read the sickening words Trent had typed on the screen. He completely painted himself as the innocent, terrified victim. He claimed that he and his pregnant wife had returned from a peaceful weekend retreat, only to find their home completely destroyed by an aggressive combat grunt who was suffering from severe mental instability. He used all the worst possible dog whistle terms to describe Julian. He called him a tactical threat, an unpredictable danger to the community, and a violent aggressor who had terrorized his delicate pregnant wife. Trent expertly played on the deep-seated prejudices and fearful stereotypes of the wealthy suburban board members. He knew exactly how to manipulate their quiet, sheltered lives. He framed our completely legal furniture removal as a terrifying home invasion perpetrated by a deranged soldier. The HOA board swallowed the lie instantly. Margaret's official summons declared that the emergency meeting was being held to vote on an immediate community injunction to physically ban Julian from the neighborhood premises indefinitely. They were literally attempting to legally exile my husband from his own property, based entirely on the racist and prejudiced lies of a desperate con artist. I felt a hot, blinding rage rising in the back of my throat. Trent was not just trying to steal my house anymore. He was actively trying to destroy my husband's reputation and paint a decorated military professional as a violent monster. Julian simply stared at the screen with cold, calculating eyes. He did not show a single ounce of anger. His military training completely took over analyzing the threat and instantly calculating the optimal counterattack. He slowly turned away from the laptop and looked at me. He asked me if I was ready to go to a neighborhood meeting. I nodded and felt a fierce, predatory smile spreading across my face. We had exactly 4 hours before the mandatory hearing at the community clubhouse. We did not spend that time preparing legal arguments or printing out property deeds. We already knew the HOA board did not care about actual facts or legal ownership. They only cared about neighborhood gossip and protecting their precious property values. So Julian and I sat down on the sofa and opened the archived audio files from the hidden dining room bug. We knew Trent was a loud, arrogant drunk who loved to brag about his illegal schemes when he thought nobody was listening. We spent 3 solid hours sifting through the digital wavelengths, listening to the disgusting victory party Trent had thrown with his sleazy tech firm friends. We scrubbed through the audio with absolute precision, waiting for the perfect piece of leverage. And then we found it. It was recorded around 2 in the morning on the night of the party. Trent was slurring heavily, boasting to his friends about his grand master plan for the house. We sat in the quiet hotel room and listened as Trent completely laid out his illegal intentions for the entire neighborhood. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized the absolute magnitude of the weapon we had just uncovered. I grabbed a portable Bluetooth speaker from my travel bag, and Julian downloaded the unedited raw audio file directly to my secure phone. We were not just going to defend ourselves. We were going to completely annihilate Trent in front of the entire community. The evening air was crisp and cool as Julian and I pulled up to the sprawling community clubhouse. The parking lot was completely packed with expensive imported cars. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out for the emergency spectacle. We walked up the paved stone path, and I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares of my neighbors burning into us. People were whispering behind their hands and pulling their coats tighter around their shoulders as if Julian was a wild animal about to break loose. We ignored every single one of them. Julian walked with perfect military posture, his head held high and his face completely unreadable. I walked right beside him, gripping my phone and the portable speaker in my coat pocket. We pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked into the main meeting hall. The room was packed with over 50 wealthy homeowners sitting in folding chairs. At the front of the room, the Hua board sat behind a long folding table, looking incredibly stern and self-important. Margaret sat directly in the center wearing a stiff tailored suit and holding a wooden gavel. And right in the front row, sitting in a chair specifically reserved for victims, was Trent. Malia was sitting right next to him, clutching a tissue and putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was sobbing quietly and rubbing her fake pregnant belly, looking around the room with wide, terrified eyes. When Trent saw us walk through the doors, he immediately shrank back in his chair and pointed a shaking finger at Julian. He stage whispered to Margaret, claiming that the aggressive veteran had arrived to terrorize them further. Several neighbors actually gasped and moved their chairs slightly away from us. Margaret slammed her wooden gavel onto the table, demanding absolute silence. She glared down her nose at us and announced that this hearing was officially in session. She stated that the board had gathered to address the severe and immediate threat posed by Julian. She did not even ask for our side of the story. She immediately yielded the floor to Trent, allowing him to spin his web of complete garbage. Trent stood up slowly, acting as if he was physically exhausted by the trauma we had supposedly inflicted upon him. He walked to the center of the room and delivered a sickening, Oscar-worthy monologue. He told the crowd how much he loved this quiet, pristine neighborhood and how he had only wanted to raise his new baby in a safe environment. He wiped a fake tear from his eye and described the horror of returning home to find his entire life ripped apart. He looked directly at the crowd and used his slick corporate charm to manipulate every single person in the room. He called Julian a ticking time bomb, a dangerous man who brought the horrors of war right into their peaceful suburban paradise. He begged the board to vote for an immediate injunction to ban Julian from the community before someone got seriously hurt. The crowd was completely captivated. Several women in the front row were nodding in deep, sympathetic agreement. Margaret looked at Trent with maternal pity and then turned her furious glare toward me. She asked me if I had anything to say before the board cast their final vote to remove my husband from the premises. I stood up slowly and walked right to the front of the room. I did not look angry or defensive. I looked perfectly calm. I placed my portable Bluetooth speaker directly onto Margaret's table, right next to her wooden gavel. I pulled out my phone and synced the devices. I looked at the crowd, and then I looked dead into Trent's suddenly nervous eyes. I told the board that Trent was absolutely right about one thing. I agreed that this neighborhood was a beautiful, quiet place that relied on strict rules to maintain its incredible property value. I said it would be an absolute tragedy if someone were to completely destroy that peace for their own selfish financial gain. Margaret frowned deeply, looking confused by my statement. She asked me what on earth I was talking about. I did not answer her. I simply pressed play on my phone and let Trent speak for himself. The crystal-clear audio of Trent's drunken voice suddenly blasted out of the high-definition speaker, echoing loudly through the entire clubhouse. The crowd went dead silent as they recognized the unmistakable sound of Trent slurring and laughing hysterically. The audio clip started right at the climax of his sleazy victory party. The entire room listened in absolute horror as Trent's recorded voice boomed through the speakers. He was bragging loudly to his friends about how he had successfully scammed his way into the neighborhood. Then the audio shifted to his master plan. Trent laughed cruelly and called the entire Ho board a bunch of gullible suburban idiots who had too much money and zero actual brains. Margaret's jaw literally dropped open in shock. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, but the audio was not done yet. Trent's voice continued detailing exactly what he planned to do with my 5,000 square foot estate. He told his friends that he was going to chop the massive house into 6 separate illegal short-term rental units. He bragged that he was going to advertise the property as a luxury party mansion for massive bachelor parties and wild college weekends. He laughed hysterically about how much money he was going to make bringing dozens of loud, drunken strangers into the quiet, gated community every single weekend. He explicitly stated that he did not care if the constant noise and trash completely tanked the surrounding property values because he would be making a fortune off the illegal party rentals. I hit pause on my phone and the silence in the clubhouse was absolutely deafening. I looked at the board members. Every single one of them was staring at Trent with pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. Margaret's face had turned a deep, violent shade of purple. The wealthy neighbors who had just been nodding in sympathy were now looking at Trent like he was the most disgusting creature on earth. They did not care about family drama or stolen furniture, but threatening to turn their pristine, quiet neighborhood into a trashed, short-term party hub was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Trent tried to stand up, his hands waving frantically in the air. He stuttered and stammered, trying to claim the audio was fake or altered, but nobody was listening to him. Malia was staring at the floor, looking like she wanted to melt into the foundation. Margaret did not even use her gavel. She simply stood up and pointed a shaking, furious finger straight at the main exit. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with absolute rage. She told Trent that he was a vile, disgusting parasite. She announced loudly that he and his entire family were permanently banned from all community property, including the clubhouse, the private parks, and the swimming pools. She promised him that if he even attempted to list the property as a short-term rental, the HOA would sue him into absolute bankruptcy before the first guest even arrived. The entire room erupted into angry shouts agreeing with Margaret and demanding that Trent leave the premises immediately. The sheer hostility was overwhelming. Trent realized he was completely surrounded by dozens of furious, wealthy homeowners who wanted nothing more than to see him destroyed. He grabbed Malia's arm and practically dragged her toward the back doors, desperately fleeing the angry mob he had tried to manipulate. Julian and I stood quietly at the front of the room, watching the glorious, chaotic downfall of his ridiculous plan. The military intelligence flex had worked perfectly, but as Trent reached the heavy glass exit doors, he suddenly stopped. He turned around and looked back at Julian and me through the angry crowd. The terrified, panicked look on his face completely vanished. It was replaced by a dark, maniacal, desperate smile. He started laughing, a hollow, manic sound that cut through the shouting neighbors. He ignored the angry homeowners and stared directly into my eyes. He yelled over the noise, telling me that I could play my little audio tricks and turn the neighborhood against him all I wanted. He said none of it mattered anymore. Trent pulled his phone out of his pocket and waved it in the air like a weapon. He shouted that while I was busy packing up my furniture and playing games with the HOA, he had been busy finalizing his ultimate backup plan. He grinned with pure malicious intent and revealed his final desperate card. He screamed across the room that the bank had just approved his massive fraudulent $500,000 equity loan against my house. He told me the money had just cleared his offshore accounts and that he had completely drained the property of every single cent of value. He laughed hysterically and delivered his final devastating blow. He told me to enjoy my empty house while I still could because he had deliberately defaulted on the very first payment, and the bank was initiating a full foreclosure tomorrow morning. The very next morning, the heavy morning fog had barely lifted off the pristine suburban streets before the black corporate SUVs pulled into my driveway. I stood on the front porch with Julian standing like a stone statue right beside me. We watched as 2 stern-looking bank agents stepped out of their vehicles, carrying thick leather briefcases and formal foreclosure notices. They were not alone. Pulling up right behind the bank agents was my mother's expensive luxury sedan. Patricia practically leaped out of the passenger seat with Malia waddling closely behind her. They marched right onto my front lawn, wearing matching expressions of vindictive triumph. My mother crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere coat and looked up at my empty house with pure, malicious joy. She yelled across the manicured grass, telling me that this was exactly what happened to selfish, ungrateful daughters. Malia rested a protective hand on her fake pregnant belly and smirked at me. She shouted that none of this had to happen and that I should have just shared the house like a good sister. She laughed and told me that now I was going to lose absolutely everything while they walked away with $500,000 in pure cash. Trent parked his own luxury car along the curb and swaggered up the driveway looking like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He approached the bank agents, greeting them like old friends and gesturing toward the front door. He told them they could go ahead and seize the property immediately because the rightful owners were fully cooperating. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked at the lead bank agent and asked him if he had verified the routing numbers on the loan application before initiating this massive foreclosure. The agent frowned and opened his briefcase, pulling out the thick stack of financial documents Trent had fraudulently signed. He stated coldly that the bank had transferred exactly $500,000 into the offshore corporate account Trent had provided. He said the debt was fully secured against my property, and since the first massive payment bounced, the bank was taking immediate legal possession of the house. Trent crossed his arms and flashed me a dark, mocking smile. He told me to stop stalling and hand over the keys. He bragged that the money was already completely untraceable, sitting in an offshore tax haven where nobody could ever touch it. My mother nodded in enthusiastic agreement, praising Trent for being such a brilliant provider for his family. She looked at me with absolute disgust and told me to get off the property before she called the police to have me forcefully removed. I did not say a word. I simply turned my head and nodded toward the dark-tinted SUV parked quietly on the opposite side of the street. The heavy car doors opened simultaneously, and three men wearing dark suits and tactical vests stepped out onto the pavement. They did not look like local police or neighborhood security. They moved with calculated, lethal military precision. The lead investigator walked straight up my driveway, completely ignoring my mother's confused gasps. He flashed a solid gold badge at the stunned bank agents and introduced himself as a senior federal agent with the Military Criminal Investigation Division. The color instantly drained from Trent's face. His arrogant smile vanished, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The federal agent did not even look at Trent. He turned his attention directly to the lead bank representative. He calmly explained that the $500,000 loan the bank had just hastily approved was not just a simple case of domestic real estate fraud. The agent pulled a thick, heavily redacted file from his jacket and handed it to the stunned bank official. He stated that the military cyber unit had been tracking the specific offshore account Trent used to receive the stolen equity funds. The agent revealed that the account did not belong to a harmless shell company. It was actively flagged by international intelligence agencies as a primary money laundering hub for a highly dangerous global shadow syndicate. He looked the bank agent dead in the eye and informed him that by approving Trent's fraudulent loan, without proper federal clearance, the bank had just unknowingly funded a massive international criminal organization. The bank agent looked like he was going to pass out right there on my front lawn. He dropped his briefcase and stared at Trent with absolute horror. The bank agent adjusted his glasses and stared at the federal badge in absolute shock. The CID investigator did not break eye contact as he explained the sheer magnitude of the crimes committed. He stated that Trent had utilized illegal routing software to mask the final destination of the $500,000. The military cyber division had been monitoring this specific international cartel for months, waiting for someone foolish enough to wire massive amounts of domestic real estate equity directly into their active laundering hub. Trent had essentially handed the federal government the exact puzzle piece they needed to freeze the syndicate's entire financial network. The bank agent immediately began backing away from Trent, treating him like a walking biohazard. The agent stammered that the bank would be fully cooperating with the federal investigation and formally withdrawing the foreclosure notice due to catastrophic criminal fraud. My mother started screaming hysterically, demanding to know what was going on. She grabbed Trent's arm and begged him to explain why military agents were talking about international crime syndicates. Trent could not speak. His entire body was shaking so violently that his knees literally buckled. He stumbled backward away from the federal agents and bumped into Malia. Malia dropped her fake pregnancy act completely. She grabbed Trent's shoulders and started shaking him, demanding to know where the money was. She screamed that they were supposed to use the $500,000 to start a new life. Julian stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the crumbling group on the lawn. He looked at Trent with cold, merciless eyes. Julian explained that the military investigators had completely frozen the offshore account, the exact second the bank transfer cleared. He told Trent that the $500,000 was currently sitting in a federal holding trust while the government built a massive racketeering and treason case against him. Trent fell to his knees on the damp grass, clutching his chest as he desperately gasped for air. He had sacrificed his entire life, ruined his marriage, stolen from his family, and committed massive federal crimes to pay off a violent criminal debt. And now he had absolutely nothing. The money was gone. His freedom was gone. The shadow syndicate he owed was never going to get their $2 million repayment. My mother finally understood the horrifying reality of the situation. The brilliant, successful man she had chosen over her own daughter was nothing more than a desperate criminal who had just destroyed their entire family legacy. She dropped to her knees beside him, her designer dress soaking up the morning dew as she wailed about her ruined reputation. Malia backed away from Trent, looking at him like he was a complete monster. She was pacing back and forth on the driveway, pulling at her hair and screaming that she was too young to go to federal prison. She realized that her entire future, her lavish lifestyle, and her fake suburban dream were completely obliterated. The federal agents stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their tactical belts. They began reading Trent, his federal Miranda rights, their loud, authoritative voices echoing across the quiet neighborhood street. But before they could even secure his wrists, a sharp, loud noise cut through the morning air. It was Trent's cell phone ringing in his coat pocket. The sound was jarring and completely out of place in the middle of the chaotic scene. Trent slowly reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled the phone out. He stared at the glowing screen, and his eyes rolled back in his head with pure, absolute terror. He looked up at me and his lips were trembling so badly he could barely form the words. He whispered that it was them. He said it was the Shadow Syndicate calling for their money. Julian stepped forward and snatched the ringing phone right out of Trent's shaking hand. He answered the call and put the device on speakerphone, holding it up for everyone on the lawn to hear. The voice on the other end of the line was not demanding a bank transfer or asking for a timeline on the repayment. The voice was calm, cold, and terrifyingly close. The man on the phone simply stated that the deadline had officially passed and they were no longer interested in empty promises or delayed payments. The voice told Trent to look over his shoulder because they were not calling from across the city anymore. They were sitting in the black, unmarked vans, parked right at the end of the street, and they were coming to collect their debt in person right now. The voice on the speakerphone echoed across the damp lawn, and the atmosphere instantly shifted from a white-collar fraud investigation to an active tactical threat. The federal agents immediately dropped the heavy steel handcuffs and drew their service weapons, turning their complete attention toward the end of the quiet cul-de-sac. Two massive, unmarked black vans were idling menacingly under the glow of the streetlights, their tinted windows hiding the violent criminals inside. Julian pushed me firmly behind his broad shoulders, shielding me from the open street as his own military instincts kicked into high gear. Trent did not wait to see what would happen next. Taking advantage of the sudden, chaotic distraction, he scrambled up from the wet grass like a terrified rat. He grabbed Malia's wrist with a bruising grip and practically dragged her up the concrete front steps. Before the federal agents could turn around to stop him, Trent threw himself into the empty house and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them, locking the deadbolt with a loud metallic click. We could hear them through the large front windows. Trent was pacing the bare hardwood floors, pacing back and forth and hyperventilating in absolute blind panic. He was completely trapped. The feds were waiting on the front lawn, and a ruthless criminal syndicate was blocking the only exit out of the neighborhood. He screamed at Malia, telling her that they had to flee the state right this very second, or they were both going to end up in a federal penitentiary or dead in a ditch. Malia was sobbing hysterically, sliding down the wall and begging Trent to just surrender, but he was far too arrogant and cowardly to face the consequences of his own massive fraud. Trent pulled his phone out of his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press the buttons. He dialed the only person left in the world who was foolish enough to bail him out. My father. We stood on the porch listening as Trent screamed into the phone, demanding that Pastor Calvin save them. Trent completely weaponized my father's toxic favoritism. He cried into the receiver, claiming that his precious golden daughter Malia was about to be murdered by the mob, and that the only way to save her life was for Calvin to bring the church's untraceable emergency cash fund directly to the rear service gate of the property. He demanded a getaway car and tens of thousands of dollars in pure cash to escape the trap he had built for himself. I listened from the porch, feeling a deep, sickening hollow in my chest. I knew my father was a massive hypocrite, but part of me hoped he would finally draw the line at funding a fleeing federal fugitive. But my father was completely blinded by his desperate need to protect his perfect family image. While the federal agents were busy calling for heavy tactical backup and coordinating a massive street blockade to deal with the syndicate vans down the block, Julian silently tapped my shoulder. He pointed toward the side gate of the property and pressed a finger to his lips. We quietly slipped away from the front lawn, moving through the thick shadows of the side yard until we reached the back patio. 20 minutes later, a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled quietly into the dark back alley behind our property. The heavy wrought iron service gate creaked open, and Trent stumbled out into the darkness, dragging a crying Malia behind him. The driver's side door of the sedan opened, and Pastor Calvin stepped out into the freezing night air. He looked completely terrified, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. He popped the trunk of the car and pulled out a heavy dark green canvas duffel bag. My father shoved the heavy bag directly into Trent's shaking hands. He told Trent in a frantic, hushed whisper that there was exactly $50,000 of untraceable cash inside. He admitted that he had just emptied the church's entire emergency disaster fund and that it was every single cent of tithe money they had left. My father begged Trent to take Malia and drive across the state line and never come back, so the family legacy could survive this terrifying nightmare. Trent unzipped the bag and stared at the thick banded stacks of stolen cash with a greedy, desperate smile, finally believing he had scammed his way out of destruction one last time. Suddenly, a blinding, brilliant flash of white light exploded through the dark alleyway. Julian stepped out from the deep shadows of the brick patio, holding a high-definition digital camera. The mechanical click of the shutter echoed loudly in the quiet night. Julian lowered the lens and stared at the three of them with pure, merciless disgust. He stood tall and imposing, an immovable wall of absolute justice. Julian calmly stated that he had just recorded a senior religious leader handing over $50,000 of embezzled congregation money to a wanted federal fugitive. The greedy, desperate smile completely vanished from Trent's face, and the heavy canvas duffel bag slipped from his fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull, heavy thud. Pastor Calvin's face went entirely pale gray as the absolute reality of his own criminal actions finally crashed down on him. He had just been caught red-handed committing massive financial fraud on camera. Malia sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands and screaming in sheer terror, knowing there was no escape left. Before my father could even open his mouth to formulate a pathetic excuse, the cold, quiet suburban air was suddenly shattered by a deafening mechanical sound. The high-pitched piercing wail of dozens of police sirens erupted in the distance, cutting sharply through the dark night and getting louder and louder by the second. The phone slipped from Trent's numb fingers, hitting the pavement with a sharp crack that was instantly drowned out by the deafening roar of approaching sirens. The black, unmarked vans at the end of the street suddenly jerked into reverse, their tires screeching against the asphalt as the syndicate members realized they had walked right into a massive federal trap. But they did not make it far. Within seconds, the entire neighborhood was completely flooded with the blinding, flashing lights of red and blue. Heavily armored SWAT vehicles and dark federal SUVs surged into the street from every possible direction, effectively boxing in the syndicate vans and sealing off all escape routes. The quiet suburban cul-de-sac was instantly transformed into a chaotic staging ground for a joint task force raid. Doors flew open and dozens of armed officers poured out into the freezing night air. Local police FBI agents wearing heavy tactical vests and military CID investigators swarmed the property, moving with terrifying speed and precision. Helicopters chopped through the sky overhead, shining massive spotlights down onto the alleyway, where we stood, illuminating every single one of us in a harsh, unforgiving white glow. The sheer force of the helicopter blades whipped the freezing wind around us, blowing trash and debris across the concrete. My father, Pastor Calvin, immediately dropped to his knees on the cold ground, raising his hands above his head and sobbing uncontrollably as an FBI agent rushed forward to secure the canvas duffel bag full of embezzled church money. Trent was completely surrounded. The flashing lights danced across his pale, terrified face as armed federal agents moved up the driveway, shouting loud commands to freeze and put his hands in the air. He backed away from the advancing officers, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. He looked left and right, desperately searching for a way out, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. His pristine corporate facade, his wealthy privilege, and his arrogant swagger had all been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a pathetic, cornered coward. And then in a moment of pure, unthinkable desperation, Trent did the only thing he knew how to do. He turned against the person standing closest to him. He spun around and grabbed Malia's shoulders, his fingers digging viciously into her expensive coat. His eyes were wild and completely unhinged as he screamed right into her face over the noise of the sirens and the chopping helicopter blades. He told Malia to tell the feds that she did it. He frantically demanded that she take the fall for the entire massive real estate fraud and the offshore money laundering. Malia stared at him in absolute shock, her mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. She shook her head, trying to pull away from his bruising grip, but Trent only held on tighter. He screamed at her again, his voice cracking with manic desperation. He told her to just play the victim and pretend she was the mastermind behind the cyber intrusion. He actually told her to use the excuse that she was my twin sister and that she was the only one who had access to my personal information. He shouted that the police would go easy on a pregnant crying woman, but they would lock him away forever. When Malia continued to stare at him in paralyzed horror, Trent completely lost whatever shred of humanity he had left. The armed agents were closing in, raising their weapons, and demanding that Trent step away from her. Instead of complying, Trent let out a furious, panicked yell and physically shoved his wife forward. He violently pushed Malia directly toward the advancing tactical officers, trying to use her as a human shield to buy himself a few pathetic seconds of time. Malia stumbled forward, her high heels catching on the uneven pavement. She hit the ground hard, scraping her knees and tearing her expensive clothes as the heavily armed federal agents rushed past her to tackle Trent to the concrete. They slammed him down onto the cold ground, pressing his face into the dirt as they wrenched his arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Trent was thrashing and crying out, screaming that he was a victim and that his wife had orchestrated the entire criminal enterprise without his knowledge. Julian gently pulled me back against the brick wall, keeping us safely out of the way of the tactical raid. I watched the entire scene unfold with cold clarity. Malia slowly pushed herself up from the wet pavement, ignoring the chaos erupting around her. She did not look at the feds arresting her husband, and she did not look at her father sobbing in the back of a police cruiser. She just sat there on the cold, hard ground staring at Trent as he was aggressively hauled to his feet by two massive military investigators. Malia looked at the man she had betrayed her own twin sister to marry. She looked at the wealthy golden boy she thought would elevate her social status and give her a perfect life of luxury and privilege. And in that moment, the beautiful suburban illusion finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that Trent did not love her, and he never had. The moment his own survival was threatened, her perfect wealthy husband had violently sacrificed her to the federal government without a single second of hesitation just to save his own skin. The absolute shock on Malia's face melted away and was instantly replaced by a feral shrieking rage. She scrambled up from the wet pavement, ignoring the bleeding scrapes on her knees, and lunged at Trent, who was still pinned to the concrete by the federal agents. She screamed at the FBI investigators standing over him, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. She pointed a shaking finger at Trent and yelled that it was all his idea and that he had physically forced her to steal my identity. Malia sobbed uncontrollably, claiming she was terrified of him and that he had masterminded the entire cyber intrusion to drain my equity because he was secretly broke. She did not stop there. The floodgates of truth completely burst open. Malia looked directly at my mother and father, who were standing frozen in horror on the lawn, and exposed Trent's ultimate lie. She screamed that Trent was not a wealthy corporate executive and that his entire luxury lifestyle was a complete scam. Malia confessed that Trent had been secretly maxing out Patricia and Calvin's personal credit cards for years, using their accounts to lease his expensive cars and buy his designer suits. He was drowning in millions of dollars of syndicate debt, and he had been bleeding our parents dry behind their backs to maintain his flawless image. Trent twisted his head around from where it was pressed against the cold asphalt, his eyes burning with absolute venom. He looked up at his crying wife, the woman he had just tried to use as a human shield, and he spat directly in her face. The warm saliva hit Malia's cheek just as a female tactical agent grabbed her arms and wrenched them behind her back, snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. Malia shrieked and thrashed against the agent's grip, while Trent laughed a sickening, desperate laugh. They were both dragged towards separate armored police vehicles, screaming absolute vile curses at each other across the flashing red and blue lights. The perfect golden couple was violently ripped apart, their toxic marriage completely destroyed in the span of 5 minutes. The chaos on the lawn was not over. The flashing tactical lights illuminated my mother's pale, horrified face as the realization of what Malia just confessed fully registered in her brain. Patricia slowly turned her head to look at my father, who was still kneeling on the grass, surrounded by investigators processing the canvas bag full of cash. She stared at the thick, banded stacks of $100 bills spilling out of the duffel bag, and her voice dropped to a lethal, trembling whisper. She asked Calvin if he had actually just given that worthless loser the church emergency fund. She screamed at him, demanding to know if he had really bankrupted their entire family and destroyed his pastoral career just to bail out a man who had been secretly stealing from them for years. My father looked up at her, his face a mask of pathetic, cowardly desperation. Instead of taking an ounce of responsibility for his massive financial crimes, Calvin immediately turned the blame back onto Patricia. He yelled that it was her fault for spoiling Malia her entire life and constantly demanding that they maintain an image of absolute perfection. He cried out that Patricia was the one who practically worshipped Trent and forced him to do whatever it took to keep the golden couple happy. Patricia did not say another word. She marched right up to my kneeling father and slapped him across the face with such brutal force that the sharp crack echoed through the entire street. The slap was witnessed by dozens of people. But it was not just the federal agents or the neighborhood residents watching the spectacle. Several cars from my father's congregation had actually followed the massive convoy of police sirens all the way from the church campus to my suburban street. Devoted parishioners and church elders were standing on the sidewalks, staring in absolute, devastated shock. They watched their respected pastor kneeling in the dirt beside a bag of stolen tithe money while his furious wife publicly assaulted him. Patricia's perfectly manicured hands were shaking as she looked down at the pathetic man she had been married to for over 30 years. She told him with pure venom that she was done with him and that he could rot in federal prison alone. 2 marriages. The pillars of my toxic family's entire social standing were completely and utterly obliterated right there on my front lawn. Julian stood beside me, holding my hand, and we watched the smoking ruins of their lives finally collapse into the dirt. The heavy air was thick with the smell of wet pavement, and the flashing lights painted everything in harsh, chaotic strokes of red and blue. The tactical agents were forcefully marching Malia toward the back of a waiting armored police cruiser. She was stumbling over her own feet, her designer clothes ruined and stained with mud from being shoved to the ground by her own husband. She looked around wildly, realizing that Trent had completely thrown her to the wolves and that our parents were too busy tearing each other apart to save her. She locked eyes with me. I was standing on the porch with Julian, perfectly safe and completely untouchable. Suddenly, Malia dug her heels into the concrete and refused to walk any further. She fought against the female agent's grip and turned her tear-streaked face toward me. The fake tears poured down her cheeks as she completely abandoned her vicious arrogance and switched back to the helpless victim persona she had perfected since childhood. She screamed out to me across the lawn, begging me to help her. She cried out, saying, "Please, sis, you have to tell them to let me go." She sobbed hysterically, dropping her weight and clutching desperately at her stomach. She screamed that she was pregnant and that the stress of the rough federal agents was going to kill her unborn baby. She begged the officers to show some mercy to a terrified, expectant mother, trying to weaponize their basic human decency to secure her own release. The agents hesitated for just a fraction of a second, their professional training kicking in at the mention of a potential medical emergency. I did not hesitate. I slowly walked down the porch steps, the cold night air biting at my skin. Julian walked right beside me, a silent guardian as I approached the squad car. Malia looked at me with wild, desperate hope, thinking that her ultimate trump card was finally going to work. She actually thought the pregnancy lie was her impenetrable shield. I stopped a few feet away from her. I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and pulled out a folded manila envelope. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just cold, absolute closure. I unfolded the thick stack of medical documents that I had retrieved from her trash days ago. I held the official clinic records up under the harsh glare of the police spotlights. I looked Malia dead in the eye and spoke loud enough for every single person on the lawn to hear. I told her that the act was officially over. I calmly stated that she had her tubes tied exactly 5 years ago at a private clinic in the city. I read the surgical confirmation number and the doctor's signature right off the page. I stared at her trembling face and told her that there was no baby. There was never going to be a baby. It was just another massive, pathetic lie to extort money and sympathy from the family she was bleeding dry. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. Malia stopped struggling entirely. The fake tears instantly dried up, and her jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at the medical file in my hand, realizing that her final, ultimate deception had just been completely exposed to the federal government and to everyone else watching. The female tactical agent scoffed in absolute disgust. She yanked Malia back to her feet and shoved her forcefully into the back of the police cruiser, slamming the heavy, reinforced door shut and locking her inside the dark cage. But Malia's reaction was nothing compared to my mother's. Patricia had been standing just a few feet away, completely frozen after striking my father. She heard every single word I said. She saw the medical documents in my hand illuminated by the flashing sirens. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The golden daughter she had worshipped, the perfect suburban princess she had sacrificed my entire life to protect, had been faking a pregnancy just to scam her out of $500,000. All the lavish gifts, all the baby clothes, all the bragging to her wealthy friends about becoming a grandmother. It was all a sick, twisted manipulation. Patricia had alienated her only honest daughter, funded a massive criminal fraud, and destroyed her own marriage, all for a phantom grandchild that was never going to exist. A low, guttural wail tore its way out of Patricia's throat. It was a sound of absolute, complete devastation. Her knees simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the wet, muddy grass, ruining her expensive cashmere coat. She clawed at the dirt, sobbing hysterically, and gasping for air as the entire foundation of her narcissistic reality crumbled into dust. Her entire life was built on Malia's lies, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. No money, no marriage, no perfect golden child, and no reputation. The congregation members standing on the sidewalk stared at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion as the police officers began directing them to step back and leave the active crime scene. They were watching their proud, arrogant pastor's wife sobbing in the mud, stripped of all her fake superiority. I did not offer her a hand. I did not try to comfort her. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of my former family. Julian wrapped his arm protectively around my shoulders, and we walked back up the driveway toward my front door, leaving the flashing lights, the wailing sirens, and the complete destruction of their lives behind us in the dark. The wheels of federal justice moved with terrifying speed once the military cyber unit and the FBI combined their absolute power. There were no expensive lawyers capable of saving Trent from the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence we had handed over to the government. His offshore accounts were completely seized, and his elaborate web of fake shell companies was dismantled piece by piece. Trent stood in front of a federal judge, looking like a hollow, shaking shell of the arrogant golden boy he used to be. He was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, cyber intrusion, and international money laundering. His wealthy privilege could not buy his way out of a cold, concrete cell. Malia tried to play the helpless victim during her own trial, sobbing on the stand and claiming she was manipulated by a monster. But the clinic records and her own recorded admissions completely destroyed her defense. The judge did not show a single ounce of mercy to a woman who would steal her twin sister's identity and attempt to defraud a deployed military officer. Malia was sentenced to 5 hard years in a federal women's correctional facility. Her perfectly manicured fake life was permanently traded for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a tiny shared cell. My father did not fare any better. The video Julian captured of Calvin handing over $50,000 of embezzled church money triggered a massive, catastrophic IRS audit of his entire pastoral career. The church board immediately stripped him of his title and forcefully evicted him from the parsonage. He was publicly disgraced, his entire religious empire reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and absolute hypocrisy. He lost the respect of his congregation, his income, and his freedom as the tax fraud charges began to pile up. Without the church funds to drain, and with her golden daughter locked away in prison, my mother lost absolutely everything. Patricia was completely shunned by the wealthy suburban community she had spent decades trying to impress. Her country club friends blocked her number, and the local boutiques refused her business. The massive family home was foreclosed on by the bank, and she was forced to move into a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. She spent her days alone, surrounded by the cheap, peeling walls of her new reality, finally experiencing the exact same isolation and worthlessness she had forced onto me my entire life. Exactly 6 months after that chaotic night on the front lawn, the heavy suburban air felt completely different. The oppressive dark cloud that my toxic family had cast over my life was permanently gone. Our house had been beautifully redecorated. The walls that once echoed with my mother's cruel insults and Malia's vicious mocking were now painted in warm, inviting colors and filled with actual love. Julian and I were hosting a massive backyard barbecue to celebrate the beginning of our real life together. The patio was packed with people who actually cared about us. Our real friends, my loyal co-workers, and a dozen of Julian's loud, fiercely protective military buddies filled the yard with genuine roaring laughter and the rich smell of grilled food. I stood near the edge of the wooden deck watching Julian joke around with his squad mates as he flipped burgers over the hot charcoal. He looked so incredibly happy, his broad shoulders relaxed and his eyes crinkling at the corners when he laughed. Our lovely elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, walked right up to the wooden fence separating our yards holding a plate of her famous homemade cookies. She waved happily at us and told me how wonderful it was to finally hear so much joy coming from our property. I smiled and thanked her, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settling into my bones. I rested my hand gently against my slightly rounded belly. This time there were no lies and no toxic manipulation. The tiny life growing inside of me was real, and they were going to be born into a home filled with unconditional protection and unwavering love. Julian walked over and wrapped his strong arms around me from behind, resting his large hands gently over mine on my stomach. He pressed a soft, loving kiss to my temple, and we both stood there together in the warm evening air. We looked out over the manicured grass as the bright orange and purple colors of the sunset painted the quiet suburban sky, leaving nothing behind but pure, untainted peace. The ultimate lesson this ordeal taught me is that a life built on lies will inevitably collapse. Toxic people will always turn on each other when their illusions are threatened. You cannot heal in the environment that broke you. Walking away from my blood relatives was the hardest yet most necessary choice I ever made. True family is never defined by DNA, but by the loyal people who stand fiercely by your side and protect your peace. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members, share your story in the comments and subscribe for more stories.